Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another deep dive with us. We are tackling a pretty big topic today. It's one that we get asked about a lot, actually,
Yeah.
and that's the power of prayer, specifically praying for your family. And
Hmm.
I have to say, I was really excited to dig into this one. I've got a Christian podcast episode and also a blog post about this. And honestly, they've really given me a whole new way to think about this. So we're going to try to explore not just the how to pray for your family, but really the why. Like, what are the deeper spiritual reasons for making this a priority?
Yeah. You know what really stood out to me in both these sources was how they frame this idea of intercession. You're
Hmm.
not just,
A spiritual lawyer. Okay, I like that. I think we've all heard, pray for your family. But to think of it like that, that's a whole new level. It makes me think of that verse in 1 Timothy 5:8, the one about providing for your family being an act of faith.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because it's not just about material needs, right? It's about their spiritual well-being too.
Absolutely. And that actually leads right into another theme that both sources really hit hard: protection. I mean, we live in a world where there's so much coming at our families from every direction. You've got the obvious dangers like accidents,
Yeah.
illness, all that. But both sources also talk about these spiritual dangers too. It's like this world that's constantly pushing values that might not line up with what we want for our families.
Right? It's almost like there's this unseen battleground, and prayer is how we fight for their hearts and minds. And I think one of the sources actually used Psalm 91 as an example of how to pray for that kind of protection, specifically verse 1. The one that talks about dwelling in the shelter of the Most High. It's like finding safety in God's presence. I don't know about you, but that image of a shelter really speaks to me, especially with all the crazy stuff that's happening in the world right now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about protecting them from harm, it's also about guiding them towards what's good
Uh,
and true. And both sources also talk about praying for your family's salvation,
yeah.
that their hearts would be open to faith. And it's interesting because First Timothy 2.4 actually talks about how it's God's desire for all people to be saved. So when we're praying for our loved ones to come to know Christ, we're actually aligning our desires with God's own heart.
Okay, so that's pretty powerful right there. But here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because this isn't just like passive praying, it's almost like strategic praying. The source material actually frames it as spiritual warfare, using prayer to combat those negative influences that can lead our loved ones astray. I know it sounds a little intense, but think about it. Every single day, our families are bombarded with messages that contradict what we believe.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's kind of like you're a gardener, you're tending to the soil around your family's face,
Mm,
and you're trying to weed out all those harmful influences that could choke it out. So prayer becomes like your tool to cultivate a healthy environment for their spiritual growth.
I like that analogy a lot. So we're in this fight, right? We're fighting the good fight through prayer. But what about when we don't see results right away? I mean, I think we've all been there. You're praying for something specific for a loved one, and it feels like nothing's happening. One of the sources actually brought up that parable of the persistent widow.
Mhm.
It's from Luke 18:1. And in it, Jesus actually tells us that we should be persistent in our prayers.
Yeah, that's a good one. Because that parable isn't about just nagging God until he gives in. It's about having that unwavering faith that just refuses to give up, even when things seem hopeless.
It's like that saying, prayer doesn't change God, it changes us. I think the more we pray for our families, the more our own hearts are aligned with God's will for them. And that's where faith comes in, right? It's not just believing in God, it's believing that he will act.
Exactly. You can't separate faith from prayer. I mean, Hebrews 11.6 even says that without faith, it's impossible to please God. And one of the sources actually brought up the example of Abraham. You know how his faith was credited to him as righteousness? He didn't just believe, he acted on that belief even when it seemed impossible. It's like the source was saying, have that same kind of faith when you pray for your family.
Yeah, so it's not just saying the words, it's about believing them, trusting that God will work things out according to his plan, even if we can't see it yet. And I'll be honest, that's tough sometimes, especially when you're praying for something so deeply personal for someone you love.
Oh, for sure. But think about it this way. Have you ever faced a situation in your own life that just felt impossible? Like logic said there was no way out. But somehow, some way, things worked out. Did faith play a role in how you approach that challenge? Because that same kind of faith is crucial when we're praying for our families. We may not see the path, but we trust the one who does.
That is so good. It's about trusting God's timing and his wisdom, even when we don't understand. And, sometimes that might even mean surrendering our own desires, letting go of what we think is best.
Exactly. And that surrender actually leads us to another powerful concept that both sources highlighted. Praying together as a family. It's not just about individual prayers. It's about creating a culture of prayer within the family unit.
Oh, I love that. Matthew 18:20 talks about where two or three are gathered in his name there. He is in the midst of them. So just imagine the power of a whole family coming together, lifting their voices in unison, praying for a common purpose. I mean, how could that not move God's heart?
It's about building unity, strengthening those family bonds through a shared connection with God. It's like you're creating this spiritual force field around your family. And you know what? The source material actually suggests starting young, making prayer a natural part of family life, even with little kids.
Yeah, that's such a good point. We often underestimate how much kids are picking up on. But if they see prayer as a normal, everyday thing, it becomes less of a chore and more of a natural reflex. It's like building that spiritual muscle memory from a young age.
Exactly. And you know, one of the sources brought up a point that really resonated with me. It's the idea that unforgiveness can actually hinder our prayers. It's right there in Matthew 5:23-24. If you're holding onto a grudge against someone, even a family member, it can actually block the effectiveness of your prayers.
Ooh, that's tough. It's like we're building this wall between ourselves and God when we refuse to forgive.
Yeah.
And it makes sense though, right? How can we expect God to pour out his blessings on our families if we're harboring bitterness in our own hearts?
It's like trying to send a signal with a broken antenna. The connection is weak, the message gets distorted. But forgiveness clears those channels of communication, not just with the person we're forgiving, but with God as well.
That's a great way to put it. So before we even start praying for our families, we need to take a good hard look at our own hearts. Are we holding on to any resentment, any anger? Because that might be the first thing we need to pray about before we even start lifting up the needs of our loved ones.
Absolutely. It's about coming to God with clean hands and a pure heart, ready to intercede on behalf of our families with a clear conscience. And that actually leads us to what I think is one of the most profound insights from the source material. It's this idea that prayer is powerful, yes, but ultimately God's will prevails. It's like that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." Yeah.
We're talking about Luke 22:42. Man, that's heavy stuff. It's a good reminder, though, that sometimes what we think is best for our families might not actually line up with God's perfect plan.
It's true, and it can be hard to accept that sometimes, especially when we're praying for something so desperately for someone we love. But it's also incredibly liberating in a way. We can bring all our anxieties and fears and desires to God, knowing that He hears us, He sees us, and He has a plan. And His plan is far greater than anything we could ever imagine.
It's about trusting the one who holds the universe in his hands. And that trust, that surrender to God's sovereignty, that can bring a peace that surpasses all understanding. Even when we're in the midst of the storm, even when we don't understand what God is doing, we can rest in the knowledge that He's in control, and He loves our families even more than we do.
Beautifully said. It's about letting go of our need to micromanage, to dictate the terms, and instead embracing the adventure of walking with God, hand in hand, as He unfolds His perfect plan for our families.
Walking with God hand in hand. I love that image. It's a beautiful reminder that we're not alone in this, and neither are our families. We have a God who loves us, who guides us, and who is always working for our good, even when we can't see it.
It's a beautiful paradox, isn't it? We surrender control, yet we gain so much more in return. Peace, hope, and the unwavering assurance that our families are held in the loving hands of a God who knows their needs even better than we do.
Better than we do. Okay, wow. So much to think about there. And we've wanted to scratch the surface of this whole topic. I think it's clear that praying for our families is not just a nice idea. It's a vital spiritual practice. It's a way to tap into a power that can transform our lives and the lives of those we love. So if you're feeling inspired to dig a little deeper into this whole idea of family prayer, stick around for part 2. We're going to be exploring some practical tips and strategies for making prayer a more intentional and powerful part of your family life. So grab your coffee, tea, whatever you're sipping on, and we'll be right back after a quick break.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
As we're talking about this whole idea of surrender and trusting God's plan, it really makes me think back to that idea of being a spiritual lawyer for our families. It feels like such a huge responsibility, but also incredibly humbling.
Yeah, it is humbling, isn't it? It's a good reminder that we're not ultimately in charge. We can advocate, we can plead our case, but in the end, it's the judge. And in this case, that's God who has the final say.
Right. And that actually connects really well with something else both sources talked about. That's the power of praying together as a family. It's like we're building this united front, presenting our case together before God's throne.
Hmm. There's definitely strength in numbers, even in the spiritual realm. Just imagine a courtroom where an entire family is standing together, united in their plea for a loved one. It's powerful.
It is, and it makes me think about how that kind of united prayer can actually impact family dynamics as a whole. And one of the sources talked about how praying together can actually foster unity,
Mm-hmm.
especially in families where there's maybe some conflict or tension. It's like prayer becomes this common ground
Hmm.
where everyone can come together, set aside their differences,
Yeah.
just focus on their shared love for one another.
That's a really good point. It's almost like prayer creates this safe space for vulnerability and reconciliation. When you're kneeling side by side with your family, acknowledging your dependence on God together, it's hard to hold on to anger or resentment in that moment.
It's like those walls that we build up between each other. They just start to crumble when we come together in prayer. And, the source material actually went a step further. It even suggested that neglecting to pray for our families can actually make us complicit in their spiritual struggles. I know it's kind of a heavy thought, but it really made me stop and think.
Yeah, it is a sobering thought. It's like we have this incredible opportunity to be spiritual bodyguards for our loved ones. We can stand in the gap and intercede on their behalf. But if we choose to ignore that responsibility, it's almost as if we're passively allowing them to be vulnerable to spiritual attack.
Wow, that's a really powerful way to put it. It's like we're given these spiritual weapons, you know, prayer, faith, the Word of God.
Yeah.
But if we leave them unused, we're essentially leaving our families defenseless.
And it's important to remember, the sources were very clear about this. It's not about living in fear or being paranoid. It's about being aware of the spiritual realities around us and taking proactive steps to protect the people we love, recognizing that there's a spiritual battle for hearts and minds, and that prayer is our weapon. But it's a weapon we wield with love and compassion, not aggression.
This whole conversation about spiritual warfare has really challenged my perspective on prayer. I used to think of it as this passive activity, like sending a letter to God and hoping for the best. But now I'm starting to see it as this active, dynamic force that can actually shift the spiritual atmosphere around my family.
Yeah, it's a shift from "I hope this works" to "I'm partnering with God to make this happen," and recognizing that prayer isn't just about asking for things, it's about aligning ourselves with God's heart, seeking His will, and actively participating in His plan for our families.
And one of the most practical ways to do that is through praying together as a family. Right. And, the source material actually had some really great insights on how to make family prayer more meaningful, how to make it more engaging. One of the things that really stood out to me was this idea of involving kids in the process from a young age, making it fun, interactive, and relevant to their lives.
Oh, absolutely. It's not about forcing them to recite memorized prayers or anything. It's about creating a space where they feel comfortable talking to God in their own words, sharing their joys, their fears, their hopes and dreams.
Right. And the source material actually gives some really great examples of how to do that. Like instead of just saying grace before dinner, have everyone share something they're grateful for. Or before bed, have each family member pray for the person next to them. Just simple things like that can make a huge difference in creating a culture of prayer in your home.
And it doesn't have to be limited to specific times or places either. Encourage spontaneous prayer throughout the day. Did somebody have a good day at school? Celebrate with a prayer of thanksgiving. Is someone struggling with a difficult decision? Gather as a family and ask for God's guidance.
It's amazing how something as simple as prayer can have such a profound impact on family relationships. It's like this invisible thread that connects us all, not just to God, but to each other.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together, walking this journey of faith hand in hand, supporting and encouraging one another along the way.
And that thread, that connection, it grows stronger with every prayer. It's like you're weaving this tapestry of faith, love, and hope that envelops your family in God's grace. And as you continue to pray, those threads become interwoven with God's own heart, creating a bond that can withstand any storm.
Okay, that is beautiful. And it makes me think about how prayer can actually change not just our families, but also the world around us. One of the sources talked about how family prayer can have this ripple effect, impacting our communities and even the world at large. It's like taking that saying, a family that prays together stays together, but expanding it to a much grander scale.
It's like each family becomes this little beacon of light,
Right, yeah.
radiating God's love and grace outwards. And as more and more families join in this movement of prayer, those beacons multiply, creating a network of light that can illuminate even the darkest corners of the world.
And it all starts with that simple act of kneeling down, closing our eyes, and pouring out our hearts to God on behalf of the people we love. It's a humble act, yet it carries immense power. It's an act of faith, an act of love, and it's an act that can truly change the world.
It's a reminder that we're not just praying for our families, we're praying for the future. We're praying for a world where love, peace, and hope prevail. And as we join our hearts together in prayer, we become instruments of God's grace, agents of transformation, beacons of light, in a world that desperately needs it.
Wow, it really is amazing to think about how far those ripples of prayer can extend. Not just impacting our families, but the world around us. As we wrap up this deep dive into the power of family prayer, I'm honestly feeling this renewed sense of purpose, like we've been given this incredible gift, this tool, to shape not only our own destinies, but the destinies of those we love most.
It is a gift, isn't it? And like any gift, I guess it's up to us what we do with it. Do we leave it unopened, collecting dust on shelf?
Yeah.
Or do we unwrap it, embrace its power, and put it to use?
Exactly. And you know what I love about it is that it's never too late to start. Whether you've been praying for your family for years or you're just beginning to explore this concept, there's always room to grow for a deeper connection, for a more intentional approach to prayer.
Yeah, and one of the things that both sources really emphasized was that there's no one-size-fits-all formula for prayer. It's a dynamic conversation with God. It's about being present, being authentic, and being open to what he wants to teach us.
So it's not about getting it right every time. It's more about showing up with a sincere heart, willing to listen and learn.
Exactly. Think of it like a dance, this back and forth flow of communication where we listen as much as we speak. We pour out our hearts to God, yes, but we also quiet ourselves. We create space for him to speak back to us, to guide us, to reveal his will for our families.
That makes so much sense. So it's about seeking that two-way communication, that intimate connection, where we're not just dictating our desires,
Yeah.
but really aligning our hearts with God's. And I think that's where the true power of prayer lies, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not about forcing our will on God, but surrendering to his, trusting that he knows what's best for our families, even when we can't see it.
It's about letting go of the steering wheel and letting God navigate, saying, not my will, but yours be done, and truly meaning it. And you know what? That surrender, that trust can be incredibly liberating.
Absolutely. One of the biggest takeaways for me from this whole deep dive has been that prayer isn't just about asking for things. It's about transformation, transforming our own hearts, our relationships with our families, and ultimately the world around us.
It's true. We're not just praying for things to change, we're praying for people to change, ourselves included. And as we open ourselves up to that transformation, that process of growth and refinement, we become more like Christ, more loving, more compassionate, more forgiving.
And that change, that transformation,
Mm.
it all starts in the secret place of prayer, where we meet with God face to face
Mm.
and allow his love to wash over us, to heal us, to make us whole.
It's a beautiful reminder that prayer is not a chore, it's a privilege. It's an invitation to enter into the presence of the Almighty, to experience his love in a tangible way, and to partner with him in shaping the destinies of those we love most.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Prayer is not just a religious duty. It's a love language. It's the language of the heart, the language of intimacy, the language of surrender. And when we speak this language with God on behalf of our families, we unlock a power that can change not only our lives, for the world around us.
So well said. Prayer is a gift, a privilege, and responsibility. May we all be encouraged to embrace its power and make it an integral part of our lives, for the sake of our families, our communities, and our world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everybody. Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.